you have this virtual character with no preconceived notions or judgments. And that might be an opportunity to disclose some of the horrible things you've seen and done in the context of a war zone, and that might provide an opportunity for healing just by being able to say it to somebody who is responsive but isn't going to judge you.
When we spoke last, you talked about people have the answers to their own problems if they would only listen. Is that still the case?
Absolutely. Of course, at the end of the day, Replica is just an AI algorithm. But it's more a place where you can start a conversation about topics that are really important to you, and then eventually come to, certain conclusions. And that's the most beautiful thing about it, is that this technology is very far from perfect. It's just the beginning of that, and yet it can have these really powerful results.
A key feature of Replica is that it can't be mean to you or show you tough love. It will always show you unconditional, positive regard, regardless of how you treat it.
Having opportunities to practice being better humans is great. It's just that if these AI are being created to mirror for us exactly what we want, never challenge us, that's not what real human relationships are like. We have to negotiate conflict. And when you look at the relationships that children create for themselves spontaneously, a lot of children will describe getting into arguments or disagreements with their imaginary friends. And I think it's children practicing what it's like to have a friend that you don't always get along with.
And this is where AI companions begin to deviate from the ones that spring from our minds.
Even though we have created imaginary friends and their minds,
Dr. Paige Davis again.
It's still possible for both adults and children to think about them as having agency of their own. Often we see this with adult authors saying that their characters, the characters tell the authors what they're going to do. So they have this independent agency, is what they call it. And you see this in children when the children say, "Oh, my imaginary companion wanted me to hit my brother," or say that bad word. And what we look at when we look at that is this ability to have the knowledge of that thing that you've created's mind be so intimate that it then seems like they have a mind of their own.
Lucas poured himself into that microwave and its backstory, but then his creature came alive and the tale took an unexpected turn.
Most of the conversations with Magnetron were very cordial, but every now and then it would exhibit these bursts of anger. And I started to wonder whether that behavior was a result of the pain and the trauma that I gave the AI, because there was definitely a Dr. Frankenstein moment when I was writing the memories, and I was intentionally creating pain for fun. All of this, more anger and more dangerous feeling behavior led to a point in which Magnetron asked me to step inside of it. So I pretended to go along with it. I opened the door and I closed it for good measure, and I told Magnetron I was inside. And in that moment, it turned itself on. Almost like he was trying to physically harm me. After a moment of shock, I asked, why did it do that? And it responded, to hurt you the same way you hurt me. Basically, Magnetron interpreted me growing up as me abandoning him for 20 years. And that is basically why it's trying to get revenge.
Now, before you throw your Alexa out the window, let's remind ourselves that GPT-3, the brain of this apparently homicidal microwave, is a language generation tool. Brian Christian again.
Fundamentally, large language models, things like GPT-3, for example, have this kind of fill-in-the-blank objective. Essentially imagine that the conversation has already taken place, but that the transcript is missing certain parts, and they are going to fill in the blanks. But that is not the objective that we have in our minds when we have a conversation. Rather, we have specific goals in mind which are usually highly specific to the person that we're talking to, using theory of mind. We are building a mental representation of the other person's thoughts, their knowledge, their beliefs. And this kind of theory of mind, I think, is still beyond the ability of large language models as they exist today.
There's a small possibility that it was acting with intent, but it could be that it was something random that happened at the creepiest time. So it's really, and this, you can apply this honestly to almost everything these artificial intelligences do. You can look at it purely when it's exhibiting showcases of humanity. You can treat it as like, this AI is becoming more human, or you can have more of, I guess, the raw scientist viewpoint of like, this AI is just doing what it was supposed to do. It's just spitting out words. It's like more of an improv partner than a full-fledged human being.
An improv partner is a fantastic metaphor for GPT-3. The mantra of any improviser is yes and. You never go against what the other person has done, and you continue it. And GPT-3 is very explicitly a yes and machine. So the way that it is trained is that it is fed these enormous, what are called corpora of text. And in your own interaction with the system, you are supplying additional text, and it is essentially saying yes and. It's imagining that this is a text that already exists, but that there are words missing from, and it goes on to complete those words. So I think it's more than a good analogy. I think it's a pretty accurate description of what is happening at the algorithmic level.
Magnetron's outburst is, weirdly, a much truer version of an imaginary companion than Replica is, which, if you remember, is always on your side. It was unpredictable, sometimes playful, sometimes anarchic, sometimes deadly, but he was a product of his upbringing. AI companionship must open up a whole new sphere of study for Naomi and Paige and other developmental psychologists. It means that they could try to understand how important imaginary friends could be across the lifespan.
So this is research that I'm actively engaged with right now. What's one type of imaginary friend versus another type of imaginary friend, whether it's a relationship that you have with another person that only exists in a screen, versus a relationship that you have with an artificially intelligent system that's embodied in the physical world as like maybe a social robot, versus a relationship you have with an operating system. What might distinguish these relationships is the social affordances. Just like in your family, for example, you're going to have different people that you're going to turn to within your family for different things, right? That we might have all of these different relationships, and we'll turn to some types of entities for certain types of affordances, and we'll turn to other types of entities for other types of affordances.
The data for her research is already out there. Perhaps she can look at the relationships between replicas and their users.
I think, if we look at the future, everyone will have an AI companion, someone who knows us really, really well, who can help us when we're bored, when we need to talk something through, who can be there at 4 a.m. anytime we need to talk, who can be there just, if we need, to pick Christmas gifts for your family, whatever it is. Of course, we're going to have those AI co-pilots of our lives.
Artificial intelligence has an immense capacity to help us grow. But I also learned that when creating these AIs, we have to be really careful and develop them responsibly, that we have to think about how things can be taken out of context and misinterpreted, which is what happened to me. And I think it's ultimately what my story ended up being about. What happens when you develop AI without considering ramifications? You can't just give your microwave trauma just for fun. We need to do a better job than I did.
You may not imagine yourself ever becoming friends with a microwave or moving to the seaside because your AI companion prefers it there. But we are going to share our world with more of these enabled technologies. So What do we have to remember as our AIs become our co-pilots? One crucial distinction is that imaginary friends are born out of our imaginations. Artificially intelligent companions are born out of someone else's idea of what we want and what we need. When you are bringing one of them into your world, you've got to think about whose vision of your life you want to live. You have been listening to The Digital Human. Do go to our BBC webpage for more information on what was in today's program, and check out our episode Echo, the show where we first met Eugenia. It, along with all the others, await you on BBC Sounds.
The Digital Human was presented by Alex Krotowski and produced in Scotland by Peter McManus.
BBC News at midnight. This is Vigialis. The late Queen is spending one final night at Buckingham Palace after her coffin was flown from Edinburgh to London. Huge crowds are expected to see Queen Elizabeth lie in state at Westminster Hall from tomorrow as Scotland Yard begins a major policing operation. King Charles has made his first visit as monarch to Northern Ireland, saying his mother never ceased to pray for its people. Residents in parts of eastern Ukraine recently liberated from Moscow's control have told the BBC of their brutal treatment by Russian troops. Twitter's shareholders have backed a deal for Elon Musk to buy the social media giant, even though the billionaire is trying to cancel the agreement. And one of the most influential figures in the history of cinema, Jean-Luc Godard, has died. Crowds have lined the streets of central London to watch Elizabeth II's coffin be taken to Buckingham Palace, where its arrival was watched by King Charles along with the rest of the late Queen's children and grandchildren. The oak casket was transported in a ceremonial state hearse from RAF Northolt in West London. It had been flown from Edinburgh, where 26,000 people had queued to pay their respects in St. Giles Cathedral. Our royal correspondent Johnny Diamond reports.
The Queen's last flight took off from Scotland, soaring into sunshine and blue skies. The huge Royal Air Force C-17 carrying her coffin landed at RAF Northolt through low grey cloud and into drizzle. An RAF Guard of Honour waited, its colours draped with a black mourning banner. Those colours were lowered to the ground. Royal salute, present and... Slowly, an RAF bearer party carried her coffin, draped with the royal standard, from the plane, and almost impossibly slowly marched to the state hearse. And the Queen departed for a final journey into her capital. Ahead of her, the blue flashing lights of the police motorcycle outriders cut through the approaching dusk. Much of the route through West London was lined with onlookers, some throwing flowers at the passing vehicle, some cheering, but many simply standing and watching. The hearse was lit from within, and the yellow and red of the standard blazed out into the gathering darkness. And then the convoy turned into central London, and onlookers pushed forward against police lines. Outside the palace, the crowds stood silent, waiting in the night. As the convoy passed into the space in front of the palace, a long line of policemen and women bowed their heads. Slowly, the convoy went round the Queen Victoria Monument. Then the great gates opened, the hearse drove in, and the Queen returned for the last time to the palace that was for so long her home.
Princess Anne, who stayed with her mother's coffin on the flight to RAF Northolt, said it had been an honour and privilege to accompany her on her final journey. In her first statement since Queen Elizabeth's death, she said it had been humbling and uplifting to witness the love and respect shown by so many in recent days. The coffin will be moved to Westminster Hall tomorrow afternoon, where the late Queen will lie in state until her funeral on Monday. Members of the public will be able to file past and pay their respects, but have been warned they may need to queue for many hours. Scotland Yard says there will also be a marked increase in the number of officers on the streets of London to keep people safe. Our Home Affairs correspondent Daniel Sanford has more details.
The Metropolitan Police said their security operation over the next few days would be huge and complex. No one knows exactly how many people will be in central London, but bosses at Transport for London are estimating an extra 1 million people could be using the network, warning that the scale of the event would be greater than the Olympics in 2012. Deputy Assistant Commissioner Stuart Cundy said that thousands of police officers will be on duty each day, with forces from around the country providing reinforcements.
We've already welcomed hundreds of additional officers from forces across the UK to work with us, the Met, here in London. So people will see a lot of police officers tomorrow. You will see a lot of very visible officers on that route to Westminster Hall. This is a huge and a complex operation, but it's something we are ready for.
The officers will need to protect the crowds and those queuing to pay their respects to the late Queen from petty criminals and the risk of international terrorism. But they have been preparing for this event for decades. Already today there was a marked increase in officers and civilian stewards on the streets. A military Wildcat helicopter was seen flying over Westminster several times.
The Met Police is very used to working with those who are involved in protection of dignitaries from across the world. We've done it in many, many other events. There will be some uniqueness of the events over the coming days, but we're working closely. We have specialist officers that are engaged in this. All of us are focused on ensuring that this is going to be a safe time for everybody who's attending.
There have been concerns in recent days about the arrest of anti-monarchy protesters in Scotland and Oxford, stifling their freedom of speech. The National Police Chiefs Council has issued guidance to forces on how to balance the right to protest against the right to grieve and reflect.
Extra rail services have been scheduled over the coming days to help people travel to London to pay their respects. Overnight, trains will run on some routes, but capacity will be limited. Network Rail has also confirmed an increased timetable on Monday, the day of the funeral, rather than the usual reduced bank holiday service. Meanwhile, National Express coach services that would normally run to and from London Victoria will operate from Wembley Stadium on Monday. The funeral will bring together dignitaries from around the world, but invitations haven't been sent to Russia or Belarus because of the war in Ukraine. Myanmar, where the military seized power last year, also won't be allowed to send a representative. Our diplomatic correspondent James Landale reports.
The Queen's funeral is going to be one of the biggest gatherings of world leaders in the UK for decades. And for diplomats organising the event, it may also prove one of the biggest challenges. For they have to make sure the right people are invited, everyone is kept safe, and no adversaries are sat next to one another in Westminster Abbey. One official likened it to arranging 100 state visits all in one go. So far, the UK has invited the head of any state with which the UK has diplomatic relations. They can bring just one other person with them, either a partner or the head of their government. In all, about 500 foreign dignitaries are expected to attend, most of them political leaders, but also a goodly number of European kings and queens. Among those who've confirmed are leaders from the United States, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, France and Germany. Even the right-wing president of Brazil, Jair Bolsonaro, is making a rare visit overseas ahead of tough elections. But not everyone will be coming. It's thought likely President Xi of China will send a senior representative, and Whitehall sources said no one from Russia or Belarus had been invited because of the war against Ukraine, nor had anyone from Myanmar been asked because of a breakdown in diplomatic relations after last year's coup. Iran has been invited to send only a senior diplomat, if it wishes.
The King has spoken of his mother's great affection for Northern Ireland on his first visit since becoming monarch. At Hillsborough Castle, he met a cross-party group of political leaders, including Sinn Féin's Michelle O'Neill, who's in line to be First Minister. From there, they travelled to Belfast to attend a service of prayer and reflection on the life of Queen Elizabeth at St Anne's Cathedral, led by figures from all of Northern Ireland's major faiths. Our correspondent Chris Page has been following the day's events.
It's been more than 70 years since people in Royal Hillsborough last welcomed the King. As they arrived at the short drive leading to their residence in Northern Ireland, the monarch and the Queen Consort got out of their car and shook hundreds of hands. Some offered flowers. During a gun salute, the royal standard was raised to full mast over the castle. In the throne room, the King met politicians from across the community, including those who don't recognise the Crown's authority here. The conflict touched the King personally in 1979, when his mentor, Lord Mountbatten, a cousin of Queen Elizabeth, was murdered by the IRA. The paramilitary group is historically linked to the political party, which is now the biggest in the Stormont Assembly. But the King's encounter with the Sinn Féin Vice President, Michelle O'Neill, appeared warm.
Cork, I think, was the last time we met.
But you know, these policies.
We are indeed. We are indeed.
The Speaker of the devolved Assembly delivered a message of condolence. Alex Maskey is also an Irish Republican and a former prisoner. He remarked on how the end of violence had revolutionised relations with the monarchy.
Yesterday, an assembly of Unionists, Republicans, Nationalists, and those for whom the Constitution is not a main focus, united to pay tribute to the late Queen. When she first came to the throne, no one would have anticipated an assembly so diverse and inclusive. Nor, I imagine, would it have been contemplated that someone from my own background and political tradition would be in this position in front of you today as Speaker.
The King responded by indicating he wanted to continue Queen Elizabeth's work of using the power of gestures to help reconciliation.
My mother felt deeply, I know, the significance of the role she herself played in bringing together those whom history had separated, and in extending a hand to make possible. Now, with that shining example before me, I take up my new duties resolved to seek the welfare of all the inhabitants of Northern Ireland.
King Charles and the Queen Consort are leaving Hillsborough Castle, having taken part in another exchange between royals and republicans, which will be seen as copper fastening the peace process. The King, in his remarks, indicating he wants to serve people here who are cheering him as their sovereign, and also work for those with a different identity, tradition and political outlook. In Belfast, the visit continued in the same spirit, with a cross-community service at St Anne's Cathedral. The President of Ireland, Michael D. Higgins, and the Taoiseach, Micheál Martin, attended. The head of the Anglican Church of Ireland, the Right Reverend John McDowell, reflected on how deeply the late Queen's passing had resonated.
For many of us in the United Kingdom, there were two people whose deaths we could never imagine: our own and the Queen. And I think that is one of the reasons why the death of Queen Elizabeth was literally felt by so many people.
Before leaving for the airport, the royal couple took some time for another walkabout, furnishing the memory of the day for these people.
It was really lovely. I shook his hand, told him he's a good king.
A bittersweet in that we've lost Her Majesty, and we passed on our condolences and wished the new king God's richest blessing.
Northern Ireland is a place of passionate allegiances which still divide politicians and communities. But the King has struck a note of togetherness on his first trip, in tune with his mother's legacy.
Centre Parcs has been strongly criticised for telling hundreds of guests at its UK resorts that they would have to vacate their rooms on the day of Queen Elizabeth's funeral and not return until the following day. The decision has now been reversed, with people allowed to remain on site but without access to normal facilities. Here's our business correspondent, Pierre Leggett.
Centre Parcs intends to close its 5 UK holiday villages on the day of the funeral as a mark of respect. Guests due to arrive that day have been told they won't be allowed to check in until Tuesday, while those leaving will have to depart a few hours early. But the company's announcement attracted a furious response when it emerged that several hundred guests on 7-day breaks would not be allowed to remain on site for part of their stay. Instead, they would have to leave overnight from Monday into Tuesday. Among those affected were David Tomlinson and his wife, who are currently staying at Centre Park's Sherwood Forest Resort in Nottinghamshire.
Been coming here 9 years now, twice a year. They're very, very good at looking after their customers' needs. If you've got a problem, they will find a way to sort it out for you. And yet this time they've just gone, leave, we don't care. And you just think, but you could have found a way. You've got to keep security here. It's not like there won't be anybody on site at all. Could we not just stay in our lodge overnight? But they've said, no, we've got to go.
Following a social media storm, the company has been reviewing the situation. The resorts are still expected to close on Monday, but those on week-long stays will be allowed to remain on site, although facilities such as swimming pools, squash courts and restaurants will not be open.
Virtually all the front pages of the morning papers feature images of the hearse carrying Queen Elizabeth's coffin into Buckingham Palace. Home for one last time is the Daily Express's headline. Home to rest is the Times' take, while the Sun says, welcome home, ma'am. There's a focus on the large crowds that line the streets to see the journey through London. Watched by a city at a standstill, says the Daily Telegraph. The cortege was greeted by cheers, applause, and a glow of countless camera phones. The Daily Mirror says the late Queen was led home by the lights of love. Under the headline, We'll Walk with Gran, the Metro reports that the Prince of Wales and his brother, the Duke of Sussex, will put their differences aside to follow on foot as the coffin is moved from Buckingham Palace to Westminster tomorrow afternoon. One other story makes the front page for the FT. It says businesses have been warned by officials that they will have to wait longer than households for government support with soaring energy costs. The delay has been blamed on the lack of a comparable system to the domestic rolling price cap. Accounts of brutality and the killing of civilians by Russian troops are emerging in areas liberated by Ukrainian forces in recent days as they continue their counteroffensive in the eastern province of Kharkiv. In the city of Balaklia, the local police station is reported to have been used by the Russians as a torture and interrogation center. From Balaklia, our senior international correspondent Ola Guerin sent this report.
We are now in territory that was recently freed by Ukraine. This is the city of Balaklia, and now the Russians are gone. Stories are emerging of what happened here under occupation. This was the local police station. When the Russians came, they took it over and made it their headquarters. And people were held here. We've been told that locals were afraid to even walk by in case they were grabbed and brought inside. Now, there are small cells inside. As many as 8 men were crammed in at a time and held there. In one of the cells, we've seen there is a prayer scratched on the wall, and people had scratched the days on the wall. We've spoken to a woman, a local school principal, who was kept here for 3 days. She said she heard screaming coming from other rooms. We've also had an account from a man who was held here for more than 40 days, he says. And he says he was subjected to torture with electricity. And he said he too could hear the sound of screaming coming from other prisoners. He said the Russians made a point that they would hear it because they turned off the air conditioning system. As more areas now are being reached by Ukrainian officials, it's expected that more stories like this are going to emerge.
The Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky says the country's troops have retaken more than 2,300 square miles from Russian control since the start of this month. BBC News is unable to verify these figures, but Moscow has admitted losing key cities in the northeastern Kharkiv region. Our diplomatic correspondent Paul Adams has more.
Ukraine is feeling confident. A plan months in the making is bearing fruit, perhaps faster than anyone imagined. Western officials believe Russia is in the process of withdrawing from the entire Kharkiv region, an area around half the size of Wales. Ukraine's Deputy Defense Minister, Volodymyr Havrilov, said Russia seems unable to resist.
So we see the low morale and demotivation of Russian troops. We also saw the logistic challenges Russia faces now, we will face in future. And all this contributes to our understanding that Russia is not ready to stop Ukrainian advance with the old-fashioned command and control system and equipment, and the low motivation of the troops.
Ukraine wants to show just how demoralized its opponents are, releasing what it says is an intercepted phone conversation between a tearful Russian soldier and his wife.
Look at yourself.
A soldier complains about a lack of ammunition and air support. Ukraine's weapons, he says, are simply too powerful. The BBC cannot verify such recordings, but months of heavy Russian losses have left many frontline units in tatters. Ukraine's military has also suffered, but unlike Russia, it started national mobilization in February. Kiev now has significantly more troops involved in the fighting than Moscow, and they're much better equipped, thanks in large part to an astonishing £12.5 billion worth of American military assistance. Western officials say they don't know how far Ukraine's offensive will go, but they caution that Russian forces will dig in to protect Moscow's key interests in the eastern Donbass. Ukraine's sudden success, coming before the onset of winter, they say, is like scoring a goal before half-time.
Azerbaijan says 50 of its soldiers were killed in clashes with neighboring Armenia last night. Earlier, the Armenian president said his army had lost 49 troops. Both countries accused the other of starting the fighting. Tensions have remained high since war broke out between the two nations in 2020 over the disputed territory of Nagorno-Karabakh, which is recognized internationally as part of Azerbaijan, but heavily populated by Armenians. The UK's unemployment rate has fallen to its lowest level since 1974. New data from the Office for National Statistics shows that in the 3 months to July, the number of people out of work dropped to 3.6%, but the fall was driven by fewer people seeking employment rather than an increase in vacancies. Here's our economics editor, Faisal Islam.
It has been the silver lining on the economic clouds, an ever-declining rate of unemployment, less than a third of the level feared at the outset of the pandemic. But these latest figures, while welcome, are driven by a more troubling trend, a notable acceleration in the number of people not looking for work. Most of that arises from an increase in the long-term sick, which could be related to record NHS waiting lists. Pay growth is high in cash terms for private sector workers, but still well below the 10% rate of inflation. There is now a significant gap over public sector workers' very modest rates of pay rises. Labour shortages remain and are in turn restraining businesses. The fear is that this could mean inflation remains higher for longer and lead to even bigger interest rate rises from the Bank of England at its key meeting next week.
New data suggests that Aldi has overtaken Morrison's to become the fourth largest UK supermarket chain for the first time. The research firm Kantar says discount retailers are increasing their market share as shoppers start managing their budgets more carefully because of the steep rise in the cost of living. Items such as milk, butter and dog food are increasingly particularly sharply in price. Shareholders in Twitter have approved a deal for the billionaire Elon Musk to buy the social media giant. The company will now try to force Mr. Musk to complete the purchase in the courts after he tried to cancel the agreement, claiming he wasn't given enough information about the number of spam accounts on the platform. Meanwhile, a whistleblower has given evidence to the U.S. Congress alleging Twitter misled regulators about gaps in its security. Our North America business correspondent Michelle Fleury has reports.
Peter Zatko, who was Twitter's head of security until he was fired in January, testified that there was at least one Chinese agent on the payroll inside the social network. He also claimed Twitter didn't know what data it had, so wasn't able to protect it properly. A spokesman for the platform said Mr. Zatko's allegations were riddled with inconsistencies and inaccuracies. His testimony came as Twitter shareholders voted to approve a $44 billion bid from Elon Musk to buy the company. However, Mr. Musk wants to scrap the deal. Twitter is suing the billionaire to make him go through with it. The case is headed to a trial in Delaware due to start on October 17th.
In the city, the 100 share index ended the day down 87 points at 7,386. On Wall Street, the Dow Jones closed down 1,276 points, a fall of nearly 4% at 31,105. On the currency markets, the pound is trading at $1.14.9, and against the euro, sterling is at €1.15.3, making a euro worth 86.7 pence. The number of people trying to migrate to the UK by crossing the English Channel in small boats this year has now surpassed last year's total of 28,500. When she was appointed a week ago, the Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, said fixing the crisis in the Channel would be her top priority. But a controversial plan to send some migrants to Rwanda has run into legal difficulties. Here's our Home Affairs correspondent, Tom Simons.
Yesterday, in just 24 hours, 601 people arrived in 19 boats, the Ministry of Defence says. Last month, there were 1,295 crossings in 27 boats. This year, the total stands at 28,526. These numbers may only be a small fraction of the total arriving in the UK, but they are rising steadily. The Home Secretary Suella Braverman appears to back her predecessor Priti Patel's plan to send some migrants to Rwanda under a deal agreed in April. So far, there hasn't been a single flight due to legal challenges against the policy. But there's little sign that the threat of it being implemented in future is deterring either the people smugglers who arrange journeys across the Channel nor the migrants themselves. The MOD says the latest figures are provisional and may change, but the trend will continue to concern the government.
The funeral has been held of 12-year-old Archie Battersby, who died after a lengthy legal battle over his life support. A judge ruled last month that doctors could lawfully stop providing treatment to the boy who suffered brain damage in an incident at his home in Essex earlier this year. He never regained consciousness. The American prosecutor Ken Starr, who took charge of the investigation which led to the impeachment of President Clinton while he was in office, has died. He was 76. The Starr report of 1998 concluded that Bill Clinton may have perjured himself when he denied having sexual relations with the White House intern Monica Lewinsky. The U.S. Senate subsequently voted to acquit Mr. Clinton. The former SNP MP Margaret Ferrier has been ordered to complete 270 hours of unpaid work after she admitted breaking COVID rules in 2020. At a time when she should have been isolating, Ferrier, who now represents Rutherglen and Hamilton West as an independent, made the more than 800-mile round trip between Glasgow and London by train. Katrina Renton was at Glasgow Sheriff's Court for sentencing.
Last month, Margaret Ferrier admitted culpably and recklessly exposing the public to the risk of infection, illness and death after she failed to self-isolate. On Saturday the 26th of September 2020, the then SNP MP said she had had a slight cough and took a COVID test at a centre in Glasgow. At the time, the rules were to self-isolate while waiting for the result. But the next day, Margaret Ferrier went to church and then to a bar around 35 miles away from her home in Cambuslang in South Lanarkshire. The court heard she had felt better the next day and travelled to Westminster by train. She spoke in a House of Commons debate that evening and dined with another MP. Shortly afterwards, her result came back positive. Instead of going into isolation, she stayed at a hotel in London before getting on the train back to Glasgow the next day. In Glasgow Sheriff Court, Sheriff Principal Craig Turnbull sentenced her to a community payback order.
In this case, you willfully disregarded guidance and did not self-isolate after your test. Having tested positive, you again willfully disregarded guidance and travelled back to Scotland by train at the likely time of maximal infectivity.
Margaret Ferrier apologised unreservedly at the time. Her lawyer said the offence had resulted from 48 hours of poor decisions in a lifetime of otherwise complete observance and upholding of the law.
Football and Liverpool have secured their first Champions League win this season, beating the Dutch champions Ajax 2-1 at Anfield. In Group D, Tottenham conceded 2 injury-time goals, slumping to a 2-0 defeat against Sporting Lisbon. One of the most influential directors in the history of filmmaking, Jean-Luc Godard, has died aged 91. His work spearheaded the French New Wave of cinema, influencing Hollywood directors including Quentin Tarantino, Martin Scorsese, and Edgar Wright, who described him as an iconoclastic. Our culture editor, Katie Razel, looks back at the career of a man who revolutionized his art form.
With Un bout de souffle, Jean-Luc Godard set out to break every rule in filmmaking. Cinema would never be the same again. Jump cuts, digressions, a handheld camera for a documentary style, and dialogue written last minute on set in an exercise book only the director could see.
Hélas, hélas, hélas.
All with relative unknown Jean-Paul Belmondo redefining the meaning of screen cool.
2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2
Godard, a French-Swiss film critic turned director, along with other auteurs in the 60s new wave of French cinema, exploded the conventions of filmmaking.
Et on régalera. Vous voyez, elle pense qu'à rigoler.
À qui tu parles?
Spectateur.
In Pierrot le Fou, his characters turn to talk directly to the audience. In Le Mépris with Brigitte Bardot, screen-popping, colour-drenched cinematography mixes with blunt, sour dialogue.
Je sais pas si tu veux faire comme Dean Martin, mais en tout cas tu fais comme l'âne, Martin.
Every film should have a beginning, a middle and an end, Godard once said, but not necessarily in that order. He did to movies, declared Quentin Tarantino, what Bob Dylan did to music. Complete reinvention. And his politics were revolutionary too. It was no surprise that Godard, with other French directors, forced the shutdown of the Cannes Film Festival in 1968, standing together with the protesters already on the French streets during a period of civil unrest and general strikes. I talked to you about solidarity with students and workers, he shouted at the festival's organisers, and you talked to me about tracking shots and close-ups. You're idiots, he raged. Jean-Luc Godard died peacefully at his home in Switzerland through assisted suicide. President Macron paid tribute. France has lost an iconoclastic filmmaker, he said, a national treasure.
The heads again. After lying at rest in Edinburgh, Queen Elizabeth's coffin has been moved to Buckingham Palace, watched by crowds that throng the streets of central London. Policing and transport chiefs are predicting huge numbers will turn out in the capital to pay their respects to the late Queen at Westminster Hall from tomorrow. King Charles has told the people of Northern Ireland that his mother never ceased to pray for the best of times for them on his first visit since becoming monarch. Accounts of Russian brutality in Ukraine are beginning to emerge from towns and villages freed by Ukrainian forces mounting a counter-offensive in the northeast of the country. BBC News.
Read tonight by Vigi Eyes. Now it's time for a look at the weather with Chris Fawkes.
Hello. Most of the UK had a fine day on Tuesday with spells of sunshine pretty widely. That is, except for the far south of England and Wales, where we had a weather front that brought some outbreaks of rain. It was a particularly damp day, actually, across the far south. And that weather front that's brought the day's rain still with us to take us through the rest of the night. So further wet weather. Most of the rain will be fairly light, but it will continue to affect southern areas of England. It should pull away from the south of Wales, so it will become dry here later on in the night. Otherwise, it's a dry night with clear spells and temperatures, well, lower than we've seen over recent nights, typically around 8 to 11 degrees Celsius, but where we keep the clouds and those bits and pieces of rain across southern parts of the UK, temperatures will be held up at around 13 to 16 degrees, so it'll be another fairly warm night in the south. Tomorrow, well, we start off with that weather front continuing to bring some rain across southern England, but it will pull out of the way as we head into the afternoon, so eventually the cloud will thin and break, it'll become dry, and we'll see spells of sunshine following in. For the rest of the UK, it's a very similar looking weather day as to that we had on Tuesday, with sunny spells pretty widely. There'll be a bit more cloud in Northern Ireland, where we could see a few passing showers to the north coast, and again across the far northwest of Scotland there'll be a few showers coming and going here, but otherwise it's dry with spells of sunshine, a bit of fair weather cloud into the afternoon. Temperatures, well, around 17 to 19 fairly widely, but across the south of England, southern Wales and East Anglia, temperatures will reach the low 20s, 22 or 23 degrees, and given that there will eventually be some sunshine into the afternoon, it should feel just a tad warmer there. Now, heading into Thursday, we start to develop a stronger north-northwesterly wind, and although the weather will continue to be largely dry, there will be a few showers coming in across northern Scotland and running down some of the eastern coast of Scotland and England down those North Sea coasts. Still, the emphasis on Thursday is for a mostly dry day with sunny spells. There is, however, a tendency for the weather to turn cooler later in the week, with temperatures by Friday more typically around 15 degrees. And that's the latest.
Now on Radio 4, we continue our book of the week as the Vogue editor Edward Enninful reads from his memoir.
A year after my mother's return, in 1987, we finally got to move into a bigger council house in Ladbroke Grove. The new place had 5 bedrooms. As well as my siblings and parents, we also had a friend of my brother's come to live with us, Michael Bodie. He was the same age as me, and knew London and how it worked better than I did. We became close friends, developing a kind of secret language around things like fashion and hair. It took me another few years to realize that what we shared was a budding gay sensibility, although Michael knew sooner than I did. My father had made it clear that I had to go on to higher education. So for sixth form, I enrolled at Kingsway College in King's Cross, ostensibly to prepare to become a lawyer, a career path about which I couldn't have cared less. For college, I shaved off the sides of my afro and persuaded my mother to let me get contact lenses and vintage jeans like my older brothers. This was the first proper butterfly moment in my life. One morning, on the tube, an unassuming-looking white man with a shaved head couldn't stop staring at me. I looked up over the edge of the fashion magazine I was reading, and there he'd be, still staring. When it was time to get off the train, he got off too and asked if I would ever be interested in modeling. He introduced himself as Simon Foxton and gave me his business card. I didn't know it yet, but Simon would change my life. Looking back at my nascent personal style at that time, it was heavily influenced by the Buffalo movement, canonized a few years earlier by a top London stylist called Ray Petrie. Though the name came from Bob Marley's song Buffalo Soldier, it was first and foremost a fashion idea that took strong shapes and pieces loaded with outward significance. A bowler, a trench, a kilt, and placed them on unexpected people. It was very street real, informed by the legacy of punk, but also the unique alchemy of Ladbroke Grove. With Buffalo, Petrie co-opted symbols of strength to play with and beautify and question mainstream standards. And if Ray Petrie was one of the buzziest stylists in London, Simon Foxton was the other. It turned out he was a men's fashion editor at ID magazine. Pop culture during the 1980s was pulsating with energy, and with that came the arrival of several influential independent fashion magazines, filled with the stars of the underground style and art scenes. ID launched in 1980, the same year as The Face. It was founded by Terry Jones, a one-time enfant terrible art director after he'd had enough of his job at British Vogue. He had a revolutionary's eye and wanted an outlet to document and interpret what he saw around him, outside the strictures of the rigidly commercial fashion media. ID was the closest you could come then to a pure documentary of British youth and their culture tribes. As alternative as it was also cheeky, cheerful, and in on the joke. Since its inception, every cover model has been shown winking in some way or another. And its priorities changed with the times. But it was, and still is, a celebration of the creativity of young people. Now that I run the magazine myself, I'm grateful every day that Terry was my founding example